higher family. He's the most high, holy, and eternal, King of all kings, the only true wise and living God, the Almighty. Hello again, family. So coming on today with a slightly different style of video. So the videos we tend to do for this channel are quite structured, either around being a Sabbath session or an Israel Jasper report, or the occasional prophetic word. But coming on today, really, well, you could call it quite part prophetic word. As well. So I want to touch on the issue of narcissism in this particular video as well. If you recall, in the Sabbath session before last that we published, which is called The Narcissistic Spirit, I did say that we'd actually be coming on to expand more on this subject. Why? Well, because it is becoming so prevalent, really, in our current society. And as we looked at in that particular message, we saw it's going to be a core outworking of the judgment of Mystery Babylon in the latter days, which means it's going to be something that increasingly everyone will have some interaction or some form of experience of or with. So with that in mind, to be forearmed is to be forewarned. Another reason I also want to touch on this particular point is because we've all been watching the unfolding of events around what's been happening around the individual that's called the Chosen One. Let me put it that way. And on the one hand, I'm slightly appalled at, well, just everything that I've seen really around this whole event. Why? Because we really are seeing the playing out of what I can only call, and I'm choosing my words quite carefully, but you know me, just to be perfectly frank, attempted murder in the workplace. And I guess what is so alarming, disconcerting, is that really, as this has all been unfolding and just working out, is just to see really how nonchalantly the majority of people in that community all either came together to conspire or just were willing to look the other way. And it does make you kind of wonder, well, what kind of community of people really is this? And how long has this been going on? And how many other bodies or people may they have under their carpets? Because as we have been looking really at the whole, well, just what's been going on around people being so keen to go into darkness, seeking for spiritual power. I'm not sure what they're looking for exactly. In fact, in line with that, the next Sabbath session we'll be doing, we're looking at really the path to ascension, really, which links into this in a sense, because in a sense, people are looking for or going to the dark kingdom for power are trying to find some kind of measure of power or some way to ascend in some sense, or they're not realizing they're descending, they're going the opposite direction. But I want to look in that Sabbath session, and we'll come on to look really at what Yahuwah has really defined as being the correct path to ascension, because that was his ultimate goal really in creating mankind. But anyway, we'll come on to that in a subsequent session. I don't want to digress too much in this session. But I really do have to, and I make no apologies for castigating and for speaking out against the levels of spiritual brutality that we are all currently bearing witness to in the earth around what is currently unfolding and being done. I think we're all really aware. We can all see it in plain sight. And while I appreciate this isn't a kingdom that likes to be spoken out against or to be corrected, Well, that's just too bad, because that's just really how it's going to unfold, really, in nowadays. So as I say, to be forewarned about this is to be forearmed. So what really have we been seeing the unfolding of, really, over the last few years? And this really is a history that really started many decades, really, before coming to this particular juncture, as we are now poised on this at this particular time. But as we say, the actual I don't know what to call it, descent into darkness that many are prepared to do. I'm sure many aren't fully aware of the implications of what they're doing, even for their own bloodline and children. Because as I say, any consultation to darkness has a perpetual, far-reaching consequence for the entirety of your bloodline to the ends of time. Because that's the nature of Satan. You give him 1 millimeter, he'll try to take everything. And this also, unfortunately, is a spirit that we've seen at times exhibited even in Edom. This winner takes all kind of mentality. So, and what many may actually accuse, at least particularly I remember in the 80s, 90s, some of the nations in the Middle East used to actually accuse the West of exhibiting the spirit of Satan. And in some cases, they were quite correct. That very, very much is a spirit with which the West has at times operated. But the actual sheer pursuit of the life of this individual is really just appalling and unacceptable. Even though they're aware that Yahuwah has reprimanded them on several occasions, and they're not to touch. And as I even came on myself to give a prophetic word to warn that in instances where Yahuwah has made this particular demand previously, ignoring it, or the people who ignored it, for them it was fatal. Some of the people that Yahuwah removed were even kings. And he says in that scripture that when they went from one nation to another people, he suffered no man to do them wrong. So he reproved nations, even removed kings for their sake, saying, touch not my anointed, and do my prophets no harm. And yet still. And for what? And this is all really, all planned by a chief ringleader, a chief narcissist, and everyone else like a herd, just all agreed to bind themselves to the sins or the crimes of this individual. But narcissism at its core, what is narcissism at its root? Because at its core, it really begins with individuals who either have unresolved hurts or wounds, emotional wounds, insecurities. And in talking on this subject, I'm not by any means saying that I'm by any means perfect at all. Even in Jamaica, where my actual parents are from, we have an actual saying. When you point a finger at someone else or at something, you've got 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. So I'm not by any means saying that I'm by any means perfect by pointing these things out, because I know some people say, oh, you'll say these things, are you perfect? Or they'll say that I'm not perfect and kind of bring up a list of all the things they perceive I've not done correctly. But that's really entirely besides the point, particularly in view of what we're actually talking about. Because if you are by any means silent or think that what you are actually witnessing is acceptable in any way, then you really are a huge part of the problem. say as a form of behavior? Well, it uses all kinds of strategies and very much systematizes its pursuit and denigration of individuals. Why? All of which ultimately to control and to steal. This whole overall agenda does feed in quite substantially also to the agenda we looked at for the Star Trek in Destiny. Now, this kingdom is going to have a huge problem with the destiny of the chosen because it's not for sale. Neither is it for merchandise or exchange either. So what I appreciate that in this particular instance of what we're seeing the unfolding of, the complexities of it are slightly more, well, complicated because we're seeing the outworking really of, I guess, this, I don't know what to call it, travesty in real time in this narcissistic individuals. But they really are only the spiritual team of another party who's actually a member of the family of the person under attack, which really is the origin of where the attack originally began. And this goes back to the whole issue of what I've been continually saying really on this channel, really alerting Christians that if they're not doing their best to ensure they're walking in the law, the covenant and the laws, and the law is incumbent on everyone to walk in the law, not just on Yasharites alone. And why is it essential to walk in the law? Well, I know that in Christendom, the word law is very emotive. It has very, very emotive connotations, with many assuming that I'm really advocating a return to walking in, maintaining instructions, rules, and keeping the commandments, as our forefathers attempted to do in the Old Testament and weren't able to do. Because no one was able to actually observe the law, except Christ, of course. So a return to the law in and of itself is not at all what I'm advocating. Because as you recall, Yahuwah enlarged the law, he fulfilled it and made it honorable. And how did he enlarge it? Well, in Christ's coming, by now elevating it to the law of love. So now the actual intent or our obligation as spiritual, as followers of Christ, as disciples of his, is firstly to love the Lord our God, so Yahuwah, with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our might, so with all of our strength. And then secondarily, once Yahuwah has done an intervening work of grace on us, we can then love others as ourselves, to love our neighbor as ourselves. So I said, note, the obligation isn't to love everyone, and even Yahuwah doesn't love everyone. I know many do actually say that he does, but that's not at all the case. But we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. So in those two laws, or those two instructions, if you want, or commands, is fulfilled all the law and the prophets. Because, of course, if you love your neighbor, you're not going to want to kill them or steal from them or bear false witness, lie against them, or harm them in any way. And this really is the actual crux, really, of the law, and the reason why it's so important. Because if you're not walking in that law, and I don't know, either your brother offends you, or you see something in someone else that you either think you don't have, or you, I don't know, have some cause to either dislike or become disgruntled with someone else, well, it might not be altogether too difficult for you to be dissuaded or persuaded to veer into an avenue of behavior, or even to lapse into an attitude or thought that where you really shouldn't go at all. So as I say, the actual root and cause of what we're currently seeing the unfolding of began, really, believe it or not, with a Christian who began to pray negatively against another Christian who happened to be a member of their household. And of course, Yahuwah isn't going to answer those prayers because Yahuwah isn't the author of confusion. Neither is he going to, well, answer any request that's not in line with his will. It may surprise you to know and to understand that there are other entities on the negative side. But if that person is either prophetic or is filled with the Holy Spirit, that may intercept those prayers and then try to actually carry them out. And the person who actually prayed the prayers may think, perhaps when they see the other party being afflicted, that their prayers are working, and maybe at the beginning can be unaware that they have veered off into another kingdom. And this is what Yahuwah means when he actually says that many will come before him on the day of judgment and say, Father, have not I done many mighty works in your name and cast out demons and done many mighty works? And Yahuwah will turn to them and say, depart from me, I never knew you, you worker of iniquity. So now you have to understand and see in real time what actually is transpiring there and why Yahuwah will say this. As I said, we all know the source actually starts from another source. And unfortunately, in the actual church, there is so little love. There's very, very little love. Well, in many churches. I'm hoping that's not the case in all of them, but in many. So in the ones that I have seen and had personal experience of, I would not be untrue in actually saying that. It could be, the standards could be better. It could be better. Put it that way. So, but certainly, anyway, if you, well, okay, let me not say anything further there, because it's incumbent on us to love the church, to love our brothers. So I'm not intending to say anything negative for the sake of being negative, but to point out really that if Christians really aren't walking, Christians or Yasharites, believers generally aren't walking in these laws, then they could really fall prey to actually falling into this particular category, thinking their prayers are being answered because they may think they're seeing answers, but not by who or what they think they're being answered by. And this is what I actually say, that if you're living particularly in the United Kingdom, well, and people here might be quite upset to hear me say this, but if you're living certainly in Western countries, nowadays in the end of times, the actual prevalence of people going into, well, other things other than Yahuwah is so prevalent that if you're not constantly actually rebuking and tearing down your inner witch, you will start to function by another spirit and not be aware that you've even made the shift. And this is the reason for a lot of the actual coldness we see in many of the churches as well. To be honest, I'm not saying the churches have transitioned there, so please don't all attack and say, but I'm saying that if you're not aware that this is the climate in which you're currently living and operating, then you could be at some risk. Is what I'm saying. It requires some understanding. So yes, this spirit. So basically, it operates through, well, betrayal, manipulation, intimidation, and control. So manipulation, intimidation, and control, we all know essentially is just a spirit of witchcraft, is all that is. Because many think that witchcraft primarily is very, very, is spiritual, primarily, in terms of the person actually going maybe into a coven and doing something dark. But it just really is, well, comes out of certain behaviors, really. Manipulation, intimidation, control. So any behavior at all that seeks to intimidate someone, manipulate someone into doing something you want them to do, or control them in any way, as far as Yahuwah is concerned, is a spirit of witchcraft. Straight up. So if you were even saying to someone, oh, I'm not going to do something to you, I'm not going to give you something you want because I want you to do something else first, then that is a spirit of witchcraft. Now, what is alarming to me, and I have no qualms in talking about it because I have no fidelity to Satan or to the kingdom of darkness at all, especially after what I'm witnessing and seeing. It's Matthew 4, I believe it is, where, if you recall, Yeshua is taken into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. And Satan is saying to him, it says, he takes him up into an exceeding high mountain, where he gives him 3 temptations, if you recall, and tries to require that Jesus worship him. And if you recall, each time Jesus refutes or tears down the demand of Satan, utilizing the word of God. Now, surprisingly, this command is still a command that's really going on today. And if you live in the United Kingdom particularly, then be aware. See, when you go into certain professions, you're going to be approached with this question or request to worship, well, Satan essentially, or to worship a narcissist. And this was very, very much the question that was put initially to the chosen. Would she defer? Would she bow to worship another person or put that person in the God's spot? That's what I mean by that. Well, we each have a place within ourselves that we reserve for the worship and the reverence of Yahuwah, or the God of heaven. But that self-same space is the actual place that Satan himself wants to actually dominate or rule in order to rule mankind, because you understand that we are in a spiritual war where essentially the enemy was trying to extend his kingdom by trying to populate his kingdom with mankind, because mankind is essentially Yahuwah's jewel, or is the object of Yahuwah's creation. So that is the enemy's, what he's on a mission to try to do. So now, in the case of the chosen, I know for a fact that she wasn't they weren't in any way, so what I'm looking for, they weren't in any way disobedient or difficult or not complying with anything they were required to do. So they will always be compliant, agreeable to doing whatever they were instructed to do. Manager would ask them to do certain things or implement certain policies or develop certain things. They were always agreeable to do whatever they were asked. And so it seemed superfluous to even require that. But of course, there were other ulterior motives at work. So when that assent wasn't given, from that point began a campaign of systematic persecution. Not so much now physical persecution. I mean, there's ostracization in the workplace, yes, that has happened quite extensively. But also now spiritual attack as well, whereby this person was sending out teams of demons, I can only call it, to attack and to afflict this person on a daily scale. So as I say, it's a mode of behavior that uses betrayal, manipulation, intimidation, control. But not only does it use and systematize these things, but they also study individuals as well. It's quite predatory in actually making a study. So like you take a book, a notebook and a pen, and you actually make an analysis of that person. You study their vulnerabilities, their responses, you study their weaknesses, kind of looking for kind of weak spots that you can try to drive a wedge in, or that they can try to break that individual into submission, into subjugation, utilizing that point or spot that they've actually discovered. And they'll do that through a raft of different ways. They normally do it by actually creating a community of people, either within that workplace, within the community, to all agree, to come together around a narrative that they actually devise and pluck out of thin air against that individual. So, like projection, if you will. And the dangerous thing with projection is that when people are trying to project these behaviors onto you, and usually what they do is they take the worst of their own attributes and qualities and they try to project that onto the personality or the character of their victim. And the worst thing about that is that because they do it behind closed doors, around furtive discussions that individual isn't invited to, and they all agree, because as a group, that they're going to kind of maintain that attitude or belief about that individual. So consequently, when that individual then has interactions with the person who's been corrupted or approached to also carry this narrative, and realizing that they're kind of responding to them in a kind of odd kind of way, it then kind of results in your own behavior kind of being kind of displaced, if you know what I mean. So it can make it look like, the idea is to make it look like what is being said about you is true. So they're trying to destabilize the individual with a narrative, a lying narrative, essentially. So the studies of the lengths that they have gone to, particularly as we can see in this particular case, have really been quite astounding. They've literally built a whole infrastructure around that individual. They've even gone into the individual's private life to recruit and to link up with their family members as well, including the ones who initiated the actual attack, to pull them fully in to the overall network, to now begin to actually close in like a sort of crab formation structure from every side on that individual. And they do that by doing a raft or a number of things. They'll first of all approach or look quite closely into that person's support network. And every reasonable good person that the person has in their network, they'll then also approach behind closed doors or behind the scenes and intimidate and push them back and try to make them leave that individual or to come out of the proximity of that individual. So the aim being to isolate that person. So to remove any kind of support they may have that could potentially help them to survive or get over any form of attack is the object of what they're actually seeking to do. And some of the intimidation can be kind of bordering on threats of violence as well. And another thing they quite like to do as well is even to intimidate. So they may come to the individual as well. And they're trying to make worship them. I can only call it of a better term. And usually they'll threaten they can also threaten to murder someone in their family. And this isn't uncommon. I also even heard of a testimony of another whistleblower on YouTube some years ago. He said he was approached by a member of this kind of narcissistic gang within his workplace, because they knew he had blown the whistle on some kind of wrongdoing that had been going on within this kind of corporation, this corporate structure. And he said that the person threatened him and threatened to put someone within his family in the hospital. And he sort of answered the person quite roughly, pushed them verbally back, and kind of laughed it off, kind of brushed it off. He said within about a week, I think no longer than that, a week later, he said 11 members of his family all ended up in A&E in the same week, in 1 week. So I don't think anyone in that particular case died, but I do recall his actual incredulity at what actually transpired. But that's another kind of cheap tactic they do actually employ. So these things really do go on really all the time, particularly in workplaces, professional settings. Why? Because they're part of the overall tabernacle structure also. And it's one of the reasons I do actually talk about the tabernacles quite unashamedly. as well. Something I've had personal experience or encounters with, unfortunately. If there was any kind of, well, Yahuwah will bring justice really in the situation. Let me leave it at that. Because in any legitimate democracy, even in a fair and righteous judicial system, it should be a crime for you to have a community or a group within a group who have special privileges to enforce various agendas. And we see, even in outworkings of things like the law, well, how that works out really for certain communities of people who then have no defense under the law, essentially. And that very much is the case, certainly for rights for Black people in the United Kingdom. I would probably say, I wouldn't say in its defense, but I probably would say that it is a little bit more nuanced now. And I notice that some of the actual instances we're seeing in justice, particularly around brown and Yashraite peoples, are not so disproportionate, let me put it, as we have seen historically. Because I've been noting or watching the judicial system for many years, particularly in relation to justice in Yashraite or brown Yashraite cases. And we have really seen some things. Let me just say that. But I say that really because, as I say, we've all been watching the unfolding of what is effectively attempted, as I've said, MURD, ER, in plain sight. And it's utterly unacceptable and appalling. And I'm making this video. I don't particularly like making videos of this sort of a nature, but I think it's an important video and point to make so that people are precisely aware. I'm kind of going on record to make people aware that is actually what they are seeing, just in case anyone's in any doubt. So as I say, they build whole infrastructures whereby they study their victims and build whole infrastructures of manipulation, really, that are very detailed, very intricate around all sectors of the person's life. They'll go into the person's private life, locate their friends, family, even people who may be abroad. I mean, no expense is kind of spared around this whole agenda. And they calculate, really, what they can extract from these individuals, from these people. So many are actually saying that the chosen was actually telling her dreams to her family and sharing things that Yahuwah had given to them. That's not at all the case. Because we've already given the actual spiritual mapping, really, around the whole Mystery Babylon, a current beast system, to understand that now as an antiquity, we saw Nebuchadnezzar, he retained diviners, enchanters, stargazers, astrologers, prognosticators, and sorcerers, a whole litany of spiritualists, for want of a better term, as well as he also retained Prophet Daniel, who wasn't a spiritualist or a spiritist. He was actually a prophet of the Most High God, as part of his retinue, to provide him with advice and consultancy for his kingdom. And then as now is no different. So it's still a kingdom that still does retain diviners, stargazers, prognosticators, enchanters, sorcerers, magicians. It hasn't changed its spots at all in all its iterations, from the first through to now the fourth beast system, which we all currently globally reside today, as it's a global system of governance and rule. So it's not always the case. A chosen one will actually tell her dreams to others as to how they are discovered and found out. Not at all the case. But as a system, it will actually work to uncover, or because every life is actually made with a covering. You has actually covered every life. But this one will actually try to actually uncover its victims, to then do inquiries by divination and also star gazing as well, astrology as well. So astrology, well, there's two kind of facets. It's kind of the overall astrology we can do externally, actually looking at the actual location of the stars. That's also done. And then there's also a kind of spiritual side to astrology, or stargazing as well, whereby the actual stars of individuals are then examined and looked into. And the whole reason this kingdom does that is to see what they can extract, essentially, because we looked at the actual merchandise of Mystery Babylon, that she's a kingdom that not only merchandises in physical goods and commodities, but also in the souls and stars, or the souls and slaves as well, of men. So chiefly the slaves being Yasharel, because they are still deemed to be in slavery, because the actual laws, as we've said, mandating Israel as still slaves, are still officially in force. They're still officially on the actual statute books to this present day. They've not been repealed or anything. And as far as Yahuwah is concerned, the God of heaven, what he's actually saying in this book, he also deems his people to still be in captivity also, even though we're not, or we would actually say we're not, but that's what he actually deems it to be. So it's a system that does use divination extensively to make those inquiries, to see what they can extract. So our present system, she is Meher Shalal Hashbaz, is another name for her, which was a name that Isaiah gave her, who was the actual prophet who actually prophesied her into existence, if you like, or foretold of her coming into existence in antiquity. That's about 700 years before the coming of Christ. So Meher Shalal Hashbaz, meaning quickly to the spoil, swiftly to the plunder. So in that agenda, they then, as I say, betray, lie, study their victims, build up intricate architectures and infrastructures to manipulate and to deceive as well, to build up narratives usually against the individuals in the workplace, across all facets of the actual individual's life. They do their best to actually take over around them. So they drive away all of their reliable network, support systems, until the individual finds themselves quite isolated and totally on their own. And they then start to do their studies. And then they also then, at that stage, begin to start to emulate. We looked at this in the Star Trade in Destiny, the actual second stage, and the second or the third stage, I think it is, in the actual agenda to try to steal the star or destiny of another individual, is emulation. And in that stage, they then begin to try to start to dress like the individual, acquire their style, adopt the mannerisms of the individual as well, and then begin a kind of secret silent competition on the background of that individual also. And they also mine their psyche as well for knowledge or for thoughts or for ideas, which they will then take and turn into kind of money spinning ventures to capitalize and make money, physical money, and currency in the physical economy on. And I could create a whole list of things that have been done in the case of the actual chosen. I have actually many of which you will actually know, because they're all now probably, I think, certainly famous in the UK, probably world renowned by now. And many have even gotten rich out of some of the things that have been actually stolen or taken from this actual system. But the whole thing really comes out of the collusion, out of the tabernacle systems, essentially, is where the actual root of it actually lies. So as I say, they actually calculate kind of what they can extract or find. And then they actually begin to systematically try to determine what they need to do to, well, not only break that individual into subjection, in many cases, or in some cases, they may want to remove the person completely. So they will kind of study their agenda to do that, and then put the kind of pawns into place to bring that to pass or to make that a reality. But they'll do so spiritually first, on spiritual altars. They will actually do that first. And I won't go into too much detail around that. So it's very systematic, these are psychological means, essentially, and mechanisms, all while smiling in the face of the individual, thinking they have them totally cornered and deceived, and they have no clue what's going on. And they do tend to look for people they deem to be empathetic, or people they think are perhaps nice or kind people, because their reasoning is that the person will be too nice to actually retaliate and return kind of what they're doing back to them in kind on an individualistic basis. But in the case of the actual chosen, or those from the people of God, there's actually no need for that at all, because it's way better to leave it to Yahuwah, because he has said that he, vengeance is his, he will repay, and he knows best how to do that. So all we have to do really is respond as you would command us to, and leave the rest to him, really. So in that, doing that, we just heap up coals of fire, as the word of God says, on the head of the perpetrator, which will make their judgment all the worst, really, for them. So it just begins to wage a systematic campaign. So if they are not able to manipulate you or to intimidate you into doing what they command individually, they will begin to recruit against you. And this can go to all kinds of extremes, really. So the recruitment, when they start to recruit against you, particularly in a workplace setting, the aim really is to remove you from your job completely, to get you fired. Actually, so when you do see these forms of behavior, well, it really is time to really pray to Yahuwah and revert to warring in prayer against it, because the intention is to remove you from the job completely, from the role completely. Or, as I've seen in some cases, in another case, I've actually seen where this was actually being done, and they were actually recruiting to remove an individual from her role. That somehow didn't work, because the boss, I don't know, he was kind of agreeing with kind of what the group were doing. He kind of was agreeing, but he didn't actually agree that the person should be removed from their role, so they weren't actually removed. And I guess the person hadn't done anything wrong, so it would have been difficult to remove them without kind of any wrongdoing. But what did actually result is that, well, in one case, it resulted that the person was actually removed from the actual contract or the actual piece of work they were actually doing or working on. And that piece of work was given to someone else. So in one particular case, I saw this transpire. They actually brought in a specialist who had expertise in a particular aspect that the company didn't have any knowledge in, to do a particular piece of work. When they hired the specialist was quite kind of good at what they did, and that kind of ired some of the people within the business, who then conspired and all came together to, at first they tried to remove the person from the actual job completely. That didn't work. So what they then kind of managed to do was get the boss to actually take the piece of work they brought the specialist in to do and assign it to someone within the company who didn't have the expertise, which is the reason they actually went out to the marketplace to bring the expert in the first place. But anyway, he took the piece of work away from the actual specialist they brought in, gave it to another layperson within the business, who kind of postured, made all the right noises, and who was also a core part of the team who wanted the actual expert removed. And of course, after they gave the actual piece of work to the other person who wanted the expert removed, they didn't then know what to do next to implement the actual piece of work. And then, to my surprise, the actual person who got the expert removed wanted to actually go back and ask the expert what to do next to complete the piece of work, which I thought was quite hilarious. So anyway, that piece of work did go actually quite wrong. And I think the company, I think up to about 5 years later, was still trying to implement that piece of work that should have taken about 18 months or so to actually implement. They were still kind of working on it still several years later. But anyway. So in one case, it got the person removed. In another instance, I actually saw they tried the same thing in another company, because this does actually go on quite a bit. And the worst thing about it is that everyone generally in the business is aware this is going on. Even some senior managers are aware it's going on and that someone's being intimidated like this. But everyone just looks the other way, or they don't want to get involved, or they don't want to say anything, or so everyone looks away, and usually you just kind of get on with it on your own. Or by that point, they've all been kind of intimidated by the narcissist, who kind of has everyone under their control. But in another instance, it can result as well in the person not being removed from their role. But then they actually put someone else, another person, inside the same role with the person in the role. So now the person has someone sitting on top of them while they're actually trying to do their job. So all these are kind of key things that do happen a lot. And unfortunately, they happen a lot with our people, with brown people, with brown Yashvilite people. So I know many people say that we do pull the race card a lot in these instances. But yeah, these things don't really happen so much. We notice with other races, or with other races so much. In the wider culture, they don't. So when people do actually say this, when brown people do say this, we're keen actually not to pull the race card, believe it or not. But where it merits it, and where it happens to be the case, there's nothing else for it, but you just have to admit what it is, because it just is what it is, quite clearly. And it's something we have gone through systematically and a lot really over the years. So anyway, it uses kind of psychological intimidation as well, through projection as well, is something they love to do, because as I say, they'll project their own worst qualities onto the victim. And it's surprising how it can kind of skew someone's behavior when someone isn't behaving to you, when someone isn't relating to you in a kind of very free way. It can kind of skew your own behavior, and then they'll just deem that you're guilty of whatever you're being accused of, and then people can point out that you're kind of being odd, and everyone will agree, and it's really as simple as that. So this is all kind of outworking of karmic individuals in the workplace. I think professionally, I think it is understood by many companies that this can be the case in kind of management positions, because there are people who like to be in control of others. And I think companies are getting to be more aware, at least I hope they are. But it still is very much the case that people can look the other way. And I think currently we're seeing around the unfolding of what's been going on with The Chosen, that many are aware of what's going on, and many are just looking the other way and just not intervening or doing anything at all. Although I understand it's quite difficult, because when we're talking about spiritual things, and these people do make a point of being quite cryptic in the things that they're doing, because they're aware that they can be sued if they're providing evidence. So they do their best to be quite cryptic. So on the back end, really, of all of this intimidation, if they can't then do it physically, they'll revert to the spirit realm and then start attacking as well, spiritually as well, which is kind of what we're currently seeing the outworking of at the moment as well. But the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. They really have wasting their time, because as we said, the destiny of The Chosen can't be cancelled and cannot not come to pass. So as we say, it does operate through these psychological operations. They smile in your face while driving a knife in your back, or holding a knife behind their backs, and while destroying and fading your name as well behind closed doors. These are all systematic behaviors, really, that are not uncommon, unfortunately, in the workplace. Certainly I have seen them and experienced them as well. All kinds of conversations that you're not invited to that go on behind your back, and you're aware of them. The word of God does say that evil communications corrupt good manners. So when people are discussing you behind your back, you know it. You have to actually be numb and deaf and blind not to be aware of it on some level. Plans unfold that you're not notified about, decisions made about your own life. So that's what another thing I'll actually try to do, actually write your actual ending, or how your life will actually go, unfold. They try to then actually take over the whole trajectory of your life. So you can see really how controlling and how disturbing. I mean, people who really do these things and go into these societies should really be quite concerned for their own psychological well-being, because none of this is normal, or well, it's certainly not right. But I suppose they're not so concerned about that. But all kinds of decisions they'll make about your life, try to write to kind of the trajectory of your life, determine how your life will unfold without your knowledge. And they also want you to abdicate your ability to think for yourself as well to them, so that they think for you and they tell you what to do. So you have a situation where you have many adult people who look adult or even quite old, but have no ability to think for themselves or make decisions for themselves, because they've totally abdicated their own mind to another individual. And this really is quite sinful and quite egregious to God, because he created every single individual to have their own free moral agency and their own individual mind and thought. But it's very, very important to Yahuwah that individuals are free and that they are able to make decisions for themselves and determine what they want to do for themselves. He came and he died for mankind to ensure that man had that free will and had that ability to make that decision. So much so that if man wants to worship God, then God will actually make a way and ensure that that person is helped to do that. And if one wants to worship evil, then equally Yahuwah will actually ensure that a way is made for that person also to worship evil. If you recall, he even says in Revelations that to those who wouldn't stop worshiping the spirit of Jezebel, he'll prepare a big bed for them to just get on with their crimes and do whatever they wanted to do, because he's not going to impose on an individual's free will. But yes, they'll hold meetings, group chats, Zoom calls and meetings, all to discuss the downfall and the destruction and the death, essentially, of another individual who they didn't create. No sanctity for human life or respect or reverence for that. And then laugh really behind the person's back while pretending to be sympathetic in public. I mean, that's just really for starters, really. That's kind of the material things that we can see on the surface. There's a whole kind of layer of spiritual criminality on the basis of that. Astral projection, attacks, withdrawal, or kind of draining, spiritual draining of person's life force. There's all kinds of spiritual tortures as well, sending emptiers and destroyers and serpentine powers to inoculate poisons and venom as well into the spirits, into the bodies of individuals as well, and trying to defeat their health as well. In some cases, it can result in people having health problems and issues, and in many cases does. And in many cases, many who are afflicted will potentially look no further than their workplace as to where the source of where many of their afflictions are coming from. So I know this isn't going to be a popular video. Perhaps my videos, none of them really are. But I really do say this is to go on record in view of the actual level that some really are going to, and the levels of hatred, really, which is just so unnecessary around we're currently seeing, really, around what's currently transpiring. But it's also unnecessary. Very unnecessary. And even though many are aware that Yahuwah has actually said that this individual has been sent by him, it hasn't really spared many from still not having the fear to lay their hands on them and do whatever they want to do. Amazingly, even though they know they could die by such an action, if they have to be mistaken in their assumptions, that they are free to do so. The absence really of the fear of God is really quite alarming and very disturbing and quite frightening, in fact. Because if we had been in the previous dispensation when there wasn't grace, those people wouldn't be alive. The last person to put his hands on sacred things was Belshazzar. And as you can see, the word of God says that the loins of his joints were loosed. It means he literally pooed himself on the spot. And he was dead within the self-same evening for that violation. So because now we live under a dispensation of Yahuwah's grace, because Yeshua has come, why many may still, or perhaps they're mistaking, perhaps if they've not received judgment yet for permission, but it really is maybe more mercy. So Yahuwah is advocating or encouraging people everywhere to be reconciled to him and to repent. So this really is quite unacceptable, and I'm making this video because if anything does happen to the chosen, then you'll be aware of where to look for the actual perpetrators. It wasn't just some natural just passing off of that individual. It was a systematic and thinly veiled attempt to MUR another individual. So the police should take note, and they'll know where to round up the actual perpetrators, because we all know who they are. So that's all I will say really on this video. So be reconciled to God. To God be the glory. We are the repairers of the breach, as per Isaiah 58:12. # will restore his paths.